The mortars had been silent for 3 hours when Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane stumbled through the shattered remnants of what used to be a village in the Kandahar province. His unit was gone, scattered or worse, and his radio crackled nothing but static. That's when he saw it, a wooden cabin sitting untouched in a clearing, smoke curling from its chimney as if war had never touched this place. Kane wasn't just any soldier. He was a former army ranger with 2 purple hearts and the kind of sixth sense that had kept him alive through 4 deployments. That same instinct screamed at him to run, but exhaustion and blood loss made the decision for him. As he approached the door, he heard them, voices soft and welcoming, calling his name from inside. The problem was, he'd never been here before, and those voices sounded like his dead squadmates from Fallujah. The cabin door creaked open by itself, revealing warm light and the smell of home-cooked meals. But what force could create a sanctuary in hell, and what price would Kane pay for entering? Kane's hand hovered over his sidearm, muscle memory overriding the strange comfort washing over him. The voices grew clearer now, distinct and achingly familiar. Rodriguez's laugh, Patterson's gravelly drawl, Morrison's gentle reassurance that everything would be okay. The same words he'd whispered as he bled out in Kane's arms 7 years ago. "Come on in, Sarge. We've been waiting." The voice belonged to Jenkins, his former medic who'd stepped on an IED during their second tour. Kane had carried pieces of Jenkins back to base in a body bag, yet there it was, clear as the desert wind that should have been howling through this bombed-out wasteland, but had somehow gone completely still. Kane's left shoulder throbbed where shrapnel had torn through his gear hours earlier. The wound needed attention, and his water was nearly gone. Logic warred with instinct as he stared at the impossible structure before him. The cabin's logs were smooth and honey-colored, as if freshly cut. Window boxes overflowed with flowers that had no business blooming in this scorched earth. A rocking chair swayed gently on the front porch, despite the absence of any breeze. Took a step forward, then another. His boots, which had been crunching on debris and broken glass moments before, now fell silently on what appeared to be a well-maintained dirt path. The transition was so seamless he almost missed it, one moment navigating a minefield of rubble, the next walking toward a postcard of rural tranquility. "Marcus." The voice was softer now, feminine, his breath caught in his throat. "Sarah." His sister's voice, sweet and patient like when they were children, and she'd coax him out from under his bed during thunderstorms. But Sarah had died in a car accident when Kane was 18, long before he'd ever set foot in a war zone. The rational part of his mind catalogued the impossibilities, the pristine condition of the structure, the complete absence of battle damage, the voices of the dead. Hallucination brought on by blood loss and trauma, he told himself. Heat stroke, maybe. Except the temperature had dropped since he'd entered this clearing, and the oppressive Afghan heat had given way to something that felt almost like autumn in Ohio. Kane reached the bottom step of the porch. The wood groaned under his weight, solid, real, warm to the touch. He could see through one of the windows now, catch glimpses of movement inside. Figures in military fatigues, their faces just out of focus, gesturing for him to come closer. His radio crackled to life suddenly, making him jump. But instead of static or his commanding officer's voice, music poured through the speaker. An old song his unit used to play during downtime, something Rodriguez had been obsessed with. The melody was crystal clear, impossible given the beating his equipment had taken. "We saved you some chow," came Rodriguez's voice again, and Kane could almost see him grinning that lopsided smile. "Remember those emeries you hoarded? We got something better now." Kane's stomach clenched with hunger, reminding him he hadn't eaten since dawn. The smell drifting from the cabin was intoxicating. Pot roast, fresh bread, coffee that didn't taste like it had been filtered through sand. Comfort food, the kind his mother used to make before she'd stopped cooking altogether, before the drinking got bad, and everything fell apart. He placed his hand on the door handle. The metal was warm, almost welcoming. Through the thin walls he could hear conversations, laughter, the clink of silverware on plates. It sounded like a family dinner, like the kind of normalcy that had been stripped away by years of deployment and death. The smart play was to turn around, find his way back to base, get medical attention. But Kane's legs felt heavy, his vision swimming. The voices inside weren't just calling anymore, they were pleading, desperate, as if they needed him as much as he needed shelter. His grip tightened on the handle. Just for a few minutes, he told himself. Just long enough to rest. He turned the knob and stepped inside. The voices grew clearer as Marcus approached the cabin's front door, their words weaving together like a familiar military cadence. He could make out distinct accents now, Southern drawl, Brooklyn tough, Midwest flat, all speaking in the easy banter of soldiers at rest. "Come on in, Sergeant. Coffee's still hot. Been waiting for you, brother. Doors open, always open." Marcus's hand trembled as he reached for the brass doorknob, its surface impossibly free of corrosion, despite the acid rain that had been falling for weeks. The metal felt warm against his palm, almost alive with a pulse that matched his own racing heartbeat. The door swung open without resistance, revealing an interior that defied everything he knew about this war-torn landscape. Soft lamplight-bathed walls lined with military memorabilia, unit patches, faded photographs, and rifles mounted with ceremonial precision. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across worn leather chairs arranged in a semicircle. The air smelled of coffee, tobacco, and something else he couldn't quite place, something metallic and sweet. 3 soldiers sat in the chairs, their backs to him. Their uniforms looked crisp but outdated, featuring insignia and styling he vaguely recognized from military history courses, World War II, maybe earlier. Their postures were relaxed, casual, as if they were simply waiting for an old friend to join their evening gathering. "Don't be shy now," said the one in the middle chair without turning around. His voice carried that Brooklyn accent Marcus had heard outside. "We know you've been walking for days. Hell, we could smell the exhaustion on you from a mile off." Marcus stepped inside, his boots silent on what should have been creaking floorboards. The warmth enveloped him like an embrace, and for the first time in weeks he felt truly safe. The door clicked shut behind him, though he hadn't touched it. "I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. 118th Infantry Division." "Infantry, huh?" The soldier on the left chuckled, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "Good stock. We're all infantry here. Were infantry anyway." The word choice struck Marcus as odd, but his exhaustion was making it difficult to focus on details. The fire's warmth was seeping into his bones, and the coffee smell was making his mouth water. When was the last time he'd tasted real coffee? "Sit," commanded the soldier on the right, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You look ready to drop." A 4th chair had appeared in the circle, positioned directly across from the 3 soldiers. Marcus didn't remember seeing it when he'd entered, but his mind was foggy with fatigue. He sank into the leather, which molded perfectly to his body as if it had been waiting specifically for him. "That's better," said the middle soldier. "Now, let's have a look at you." All 3 soldiers turned in unison, and Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Their faces were pale as moonlight, their eyes holding depths that seemed to go on forever. But more disturbing were the wounds. A throat torn open on the left soldier, revealing vertebrae, a gaping hole where the middle soldier's heart should be, and the right soldier's skull partially caved in above his left temple. Yet they smiled warmly, as if their injuries were merely old scars from childhood accidents. "Don't mind the decorations," said the middle soldier, noticing Marcus's stare. "Occupational hazards. Jerry got me with a Luger in Normandy, 44, named Staff Sergeant Tommy Morrison." The left soldier touched his ruined throat gingerly. "Corporal Dale Hendricks. Bayonet at Belleau Wood, 1918. Still stings when it rains." "And I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore," said the right soldier, his authoritative tone explaining his earlier command. "Shrapnel at Gettysburg. Summer of '63. Marcus's rational mind screamed warnings. But the warmth of the fire and the comfortable weight of exhaustion were drowning out everything except the immediate sensation of safety. These men understood him in ways his living comrades never had. They carried the same invisible wounds, the same burden of having seen too much. "You're wondering how we're here," Morrison said, leaning forward with interest. "Same way you'll be here, eventually. This place, it calls to soldiers, especially ones who've lost everything else." "I haven't lost everything," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Whitmore's damaged skull caught the firelight as he tilted his head. "Your unit? Gone. Your mission? Failed. Your hope?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The question hung in the warm air like smoke, settling around them with uncomfortable weight. "That's what we thought," Hendricks whispered through his mangled throat. "Welcome home, brother." The fire crackled lower, and somewhere in its shifting light, Marcus thought he saw other faces beginning to emerge from the shadows. The voices had stopped. Marcus pressed his ear against the cabin door, straining to catch even the faintest whisper from within. Nothing. Just the distant rumble of artillery and the metallic tang of smoke carried on the wind. The sudden silence felt more ominous than the ghostly conversations he'd been hearing. He pulled back, studying the door's surface. The wood grain was perfect, unmarked by shrapnel or bullet holes. No scorch marks from the phosphorus rounds that had turned everything else in this sector into twisted metal and ash. It defied logic, defied everything he'd witnessed in the past 3 days of hell. Marcus's radio crackled to life. "Kane, what's your position? Over." He fumbled for the handset, grateful for something real and familiar. "Delta 7, approximately 2 clicks northwest of the checkpoint. Found some kind of structure." "Structure? Nothing on our maps, Sergeant. You sure about your coordinates?" Marcus glanced around at the devastated landscape, then back at the cabin that shouldn't exist. "Affirmative. It's substantial. Could provide temporary shelter for wounded." A pause. Then, "Negative, Delta 7. RTB immediately. We've got incoming intel about enemy movement in that sector. Copy that. En route." But Marcus didn't move. Something about the cabin pulled at him, a magnetic force he couldn't explain. The exhaustion weighing down his limbs seemed to lift whenever he looked at those pristine walls. When was the last time he'd slept, really slept, not just the fitful dozing between bombardments? He circled the structure, searching for windows. There were none, just smooth wooden walls that seemed to absorb the grey morning light. At the back, he found something that made his breath catch. Carved into the wood, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were initials and dates. JM 1943, RS 1917, TK 1969. The dates spanned decades, conflicts that had nothing to do with the current operation. Marcus ran his fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time and weather. Below them, fresher marks. DL 2019, SH 2021. His blood chilled. Those dates were recent, too recent. And if soldiers had been here before him, where were they now? The radio squawked again, but Marcus barely heard it. The voices had returned, seeping through the walls like water through cracks. But now he could make out individual words. "Been waiting so long. Just need to rest. Safe here. Finally safe." The last voice sounded younger than the others, with an accent Marcus couldn't place. When it spoke again, his heart nearly stopped. "Marcus? Marcus Kane? We've been waiting for you." He stumbled backward, his rifle clattering against his gear. No one could know his name. His unit was operating under radio silence, and civilian contact had been severed for days. Yet somehow, impossibly, the voice knew who he was. "Don't be afraid," another voice called, this one older, gravelly with authority. "We're all soldiers here, brothers in arms." Marcus found himself walking back toward the front door, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The wood felt warm under his palm, almost alive. "We understand what you've been through," the gravelly voice continued. "The fear, the exhaustion, the endless noise. It's quiet here, son. Peaceful. The word peaceful hit Marcus like a physical blow. When had he last experienced peace? Not since his deployment began, certainly. Not since watching Rodriguez step on that IED or seeing what was left of Chavez after the mortar attack. The memories crashed over him. Blood on his hands, the weight of dog tags he'd collected from friends who'd never make it home. "Just open the door," a third voice whispered, so close it seemed to speak directly into his ear. One step, and all the pain stops. Marcus's hand moved to the doorknob of its own accord. The metal was cold, real, solid beneath his fingers. Behind the door lay warmth, safety, an end to the nightmare that had consumed his life for months. All he had to do was turn the handle. His radio erupted in static and frantic voices. "Kane! Kane, respond! We've got eyes on enemy armor moving toward your position. Get out of there now!" The urgency in his lieutenant's voice cut through the cabin's hypnotic pull. Marcus blinked, suddenly aware that he'd been standing motionless for several minutes, his hand frozen on the doorknob. The sun had shifted position, casting longer shadows across the battlefield. He released the handle and stepped back, his heart hammering. Whatever was inside that cabin, it wasn't salvation. It was something else entirely, something that fed on desperation and offered escape at a price he wasn't ready to pay. Not yet. Marcus turned and ran, leaving the pristine cabin behind. But even as he put distance between himself and the impossible structure, he could feel its pull strengthening, and the voices calling his name grew louder with each step away. The voices had grown stronger overnight, seeping through the cabin walls like a slow leak that threatened to drown him. Marcus pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound came from somewhere deeper than his hearing. It resonated in his bones, in the spaces between his thoughts. "Come inside, Marcus. We've been waiting so long." He'd spent the night huddled against the oak tree, his rifle across his knees, watching the cabin's windows flicker with that impossible warm light. Every time he'd started to drift off, the voices would surge, pulling him back to consciousness with promises of rest, of belonging, of an end to the war that raged both outside and within him. Dawn brought no relief. The bombardment had resumed at first light, but the shells fell in the same peculiar pattern, never touching the cabin or the small clearing around it. Marcus had counted 17 direct hits that should have reduced the structure to splinters, yet each explosion simply stopped, as if hitting an invisible barrier. He needed to move. His water was running low and he hadn't eaten in 2 days. The logical choice was to work his way back toward friendly lines, to report the strange sanctuary he'd found and let someone else puzzle over its impossible existence. But his legs wouldn't carry him away from the clearing. Every time he tried to leave, his body betrayed him, turning back toward the cabin like a compass needle seeking magnetic north. The door creaked open. Marcus spun, rifle raised, but no one emerged. The doorway yawned black despite the golden light he'd seen from outside. The contrast hurt his eyes, like staring into a solar eclipse. "You're tired, soldier. So very tired." The voice belonged to someone familiar now. He'd been listening to it all night. American accent, Southern maybe. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who'd grown up working with his hands, who'd probably never expected to die in a foreign field with mud in his mouth. "Who are you?" Marcus called out, his voice hoarse. "Same as you. Same as all of us who found this place." Other voices joined in, a chorus of the dead. British accents, German, French, languages Marcus didn't recognize but somehow understood. They spoke in unison, their words overlapping like waves against a shore. "We were soldiers once. We fought. We fell. We came here seeking shelter." Against every instinct screaming in his head, Marcus found himself walking toward the cabin. His boots moved without conscious command, carrying him across the threshold into darkness that swallowed him whole. Inside, the warmth hit him like a physical force. After days of cold rain and bitter wind, the sensation was overwhelming. His frozen joints began to thaw, sending painful tingles through his extremities. The darkness gradually gave way to a soft amber glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The cabin's interior defied the modest exterior. The space stretched impossibly wide, filled with furniture that spanned decades, maybe centuries. A Civil War-era field desk sat beside a great war-issue cot. Modern camping gear was scattered among medieval-looking wooden chairs. Dog tags hung from pegs on the wall like metallic leaves, hundreds of them, bearing names and numbers from conflicts Marcus couldn't even identify. But it was the photographs that made his blood run cold. They covered every surface, framed pictures, loose snapshots, formal portraits, all showing the same thing: soldiers in various uniforms standing in this very room, smiling at the camera with the grateful expressions of men who'd found safety in a dangerous world. The photos spanned generations, from sepia-toned daguerreotypes to crisp digital prints. In the most recent ones, Marcus could make out the camouflage patterns of his own unit. His hands trembling, he picked up a photograph from the desk. 5 soldiers in modern combat gear stood grouped around the fireplace, their faces familiar. Thompson, Rodriguez, Williams, Chen, and Patterson. His squad, the men who'd died in the mortar attack 3 days ago. They looked healthy, uninjured, their smiles wide and genuine. But their eyes held the same hollow quality he'd seen in the mirror that morning. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The southern voice spoke directly behind him now. "All of us together, safe at last. No more war, Marcus. No more death. Just peace." Marcus spun around, but the room remained empty. The photographs seemed to watch him, hundreds of dead eyes tracking his movement. "You can join us. You want to join us. We can see it in your heart, the exhaustion, the pain, the longing for rest." He backed toward the door, but his reflection caught in a mirror beside the fireplace stopped him cold. His own face stared back, but it wasn't alone. Translucent figures stood behind him, their hands reaching out like drowning men grasping for salvation. Their mouths moved in silent unison, speaking words that bypassed his ears and carved themselves directly into his mind. "Stay with us, Marcus. Stay forever." The door slammed shut behind him, and the photographs began to move. The photographs scattered across the wooden floor like fallen leaves, each one a window into decades of war. Marcus knelt among them, his flashlight beam dancing from image to image, revealing faces both familiar and foreign. Some were formal military portraits, others candid shots of soldiers sharing cigarettes or huddled around campfires. But it was the dates scrawled on the backs that made his blood run cold. 1943, 1952, 1967, 1983, 1999, 2001, 2010. Different wars, different conflicts, different generations of soldiers who had somehow found their way to this impossible cabin. "You see it now, don't you?" The voice belonged to Rodriguez, though when Marcus looked up, the young Marine was nowhere to be seen. The words seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "We're not all from your war, hermano." Marcus's hands trembled as he picked up a faded photograph showing 3 men in Vietnam-era fatigues. Their faces wore the same hollow expression he'd seen on Rodriguez's face, the same exhaustion that had driven him to seek shelter here. One of the men looked startlingly similar to the voice he'd been hearing. "Thompson." "This isn't possible," Marcus whispered, but even as he spoke, he knew possibility had long since abandoned this place. A new voice drifted down from the second floor, older, weathered by decades of phantom existence. "Nothing's possible here, son. That's the point." Heavy footsteps creaked across the floorboards above. "Time doesn't flow right in this place. Wars end, but soldiers keep coming." Marcus stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The photographs crunched softly under his boots as he moved toward the staircase. Each step upward felt like a descent into something deeper and darker than any foxhole he'd ever known. The wooden banister was smooth under his palm, worn by countless hands that had climbed these same steps over the decades. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched into shadows, punctuated by several closed doors. The temperature had dropped noticeably, his breath forming small clouds in the flashlight beam. From behind one of the doors came the sound of quiet sobbing. A young voice, barely more than a boy. Korean War, Thompson's voice explained, though Marcus still couldn't see him. Poor kid was only 18 when the shrapnel got him. Been 18 ever since. Marcus approached the door where the crying originated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. What happened to you all? Why are you here? Same thing that's happening to you. This voice was different, younger than Thompson but older than Rodriguez. You came here looking for peace, didn't you? Looking for somewhere the war couldn't reach you? The realization struck Marcus like a physical blow. That was exactly what he'd been thinking when he'd first seen the cabin. In that moment of desperation, with shells exploding around him and his squad scattered to the wind, he'd wanted nothing more than a place where the violence couldn't touch him. The cabin feeds on that desire, Rodriguez's voice continued. It calls to soldiers who've seen too much, who just want the fighting to stop, offers them sanctuary. Marcus turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was empty except for a single military cot and a small wooden desk. On the desk sat a helmet, the distinctive shape placing it somewhere in the 1950s. The sobbing had stopped, but the presence in the room was unmistakable. But the peace comes with a price, the older voice said. Marcus had begun thinking of him as the sergeant, based on the authority in his tone. You can stay here forever, where the war can't reach you, but you can never leave. There has to be a way out, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. There's always a way out. A bitter laugh echoed through the hallway. You think we haven't tried? Some of us have been here since before your grandfather was born. The door only opens one way, soldier. Marcus backed out of the room and continued down the hallway. Behind each door, he sensed another presence, another soldier from another war who had sought the same impossible peace. The weight of their collective despair pressed down on him like a physical force. At the end of the hallway, a window looked out onto the battlefield beyond. Through the glass, Marcus could see the ongoing artillery bombardment, the flashes of explosions painting the sky in violent reds and oranges. But something was wrong with the scene. The explosions seemed to repeat in patterns, the same sequence of flashes occurring over and over again. Time moves differently here, Thompson explained, finally materializing beside Marcus as a translucent figure in Vietnam-era gear. Outside, the wars keep happening. New conflicts, new soldiers, new casualties. But here, it's always the same moment. The moment you decided you couldn't take any more. Marcus stared at the repeating battle beyond the window, understanding beginning to dawn on him like a terrible sunrise. The cabin wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a prison, and he was already becoming its newest inmate. The floorboards groaned under Marcus's weight as he stepped deeper into the cabin's main room. The voices had fallen silent again, but their presence lingered like smoke in still air. He could feel eyes watching him from every shadow, every corner where the lamplight couldn't quite reach. A brick fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth cold and dark. Above the mantel hung a collection of photographs in mismatched frames, black and white images of young men in various military uniforms spanning decades. Some wore the olive drab of World War II, others the woodland camouflage of Vietnam, and a few sported the desert tan he recognized from more recent conflicts. Marcus approached the photographs, his boots silent on the worn wooden floor. Each face stared back with the same haunting expression, eyes that had seen too much, smiles that never quite reached their depths. Below each photo, small brass plaques bore names, ranks, and dates. The dates told a story that made his blood run cold. Private James Morrison, 1943 to 1944. Corporal David Chen, 1969 to 1970. Specialist Maria Santos, 2004 to 2005. The timeline spanned 8 decades, yet something connected all these soldiers. Something had drawn them here, just as it had drawn him. A floorboard creaked behind him. Marcus spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm, but the room remained empty. The sound came again, this time from upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the ceiling. "Who's there?" His voice cracked slightly. "I'm armed. I'm a United States soldier." The footsteps stopped. Then came the voice, clearer than before, drifting down from above like autumn leaves. "So were we, brother. So were we." Marcus's throat went dry. The voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, of someone who had crossed a line from which there was no return. He looked back at the photographs, counting them. 17 faces, 17 soldiers who had found this place and never left. The stairs beckoned from the corner of the room, disappearing into darkness above. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to run back into the shell-cratered wasteland where at least the dangers were familiar. But something stronger than fear pulled him forward, a desperate need to understand what had happened to these men and women, and what was happening to him. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he climbed. Each step seemed to echo through the cabin like a funeral bell. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched toward the back of the house, with doors leading off to either side. The air here felt thicker, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. The first door stood slightly ajar, revealing what had once been a bedroom. A simple cot sat against one wall, its blanket pulled tight with military precision. Personal effects were arranged on a small table, a worn Bible, a handful of letters tied with string, a tarnished medal. Everything bore the patina of decades, yet seemed frozen in time. Marcus pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The letters drew his attention first. The return address showed a woman's name in Kansas, dated 1944. The medal was a Purple Heart, its ribbon faded but intact. "That's Jimmy's room." Marcus whirled toward the voice but found only empty air. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "He was 19 when he got here," the voice continued, soft and conversational. "Took shrapnel in Normandy. Wandered for days before he found us." "Found who?" Marcus whispered, but received no answer. He backed out of the room and tried the next door. This one revealed another bedroom, nearly identical to the first, but with different personal effects. A combat knife, a photo of a young woman, dog tags that read Chen, David in worn lettering. The pattern continued down the hall. Each room held the preserved belongings of one of the soldiers from the photographs downstairs. Each told the story of a life cut short, of someone who had come here seeking refuge and somehow never left. The last door at the end of the hall stood wide open, revealing a room that was disturbingly different from the others. This one was empty, except for a single cot with crisp white sheets. A window looked out over the battlefield, and on the small table beside the bed sat a nameplate that made Marcus's blood freeze. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane. His own name stared back at him in brass letters identical to the plaques downstairs. The nameplate looked as weathered and old as all the others, as if it had been waiting here for decades. "No," he breathed, stumbling backward. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the truth settling into his bones like winter cold. The cabin wasn't a sanctuary at all. It was a trap, a prison disguised as salvation. And now that he was here, now that he had seen his name among the others, he began to understand that leaving might not be an option at all. The floorboards groaned beneath Marcus's boots as he stepped deeper into the cabin's main room. The fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own, and he could swear the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since entering. His breath came out in visible puffs now, each exhalation a small cloud that dissipated into the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. "Thompson?" he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rodriguez?" Silence answered him, but it wasn't the empty silence of an abandoned building. This was pregnant with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Marcus reached for his sidearm, finding comfort in the familiar weight of the weapon in his hand, though he wondered what good bullets would do against whatever haunted this place. A photograph on the mantelpiece caught his attention, a black and white image of soldiers in uniforms he didn't recognize. The styling looked older, maybe from the Korean War era, but the faces were unsettlingly clear. 3 men stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes staring directly into the camera with an intensity that made Marcus's skin crawl. The one in the middle looked remarkably like Thompson. "That's impossible," he muttered, stepping closer to examine the photo. The resemblance was uncanny, the same jawline, the same crooked smile, even the same scar above the left eyebrow that Thompson had gotten in basic training. A door creaked open behind him. Marcus spun around, weapon raised, to see a narrow hallway he was certain hadn't been there moments before. The walls seemed to stretch impossibly long, lined with doors that hadn't existed when he'd first entered the cabin. Warm amber light spilled from beneath each threshold, accompanied by the low murmur of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. "Marcus!" Thompson's voice echoed from somewhere down the hall, clearer now and filled with an urgency that made Marcus's pulse quicken. "You've got to see this. It's incredible." Against every instinct screaming at him to turn around and run, Marcus found his feet carrying him toward the sound. The hallway seemed to stretch with each step, the doors multiplying like reflections in opposing mirrors. As he passed the first door, he caught a glimpse through the keyhole of men in Civil War uniforms playing cards around a wooden table. Their blue and grey uniforms were pristine, unstained by the blood and mud that should have marked them as casualties of that brutal conflict. The second door revealed soldiers in World War I gear, their puttees and helmets cleaned despite the gas masks hanging loosely around their necks. They were sharing a meal that steamed invitingly, their faces flushed with warmth and camaraderie. None of them looked up as Marcus passed, but he could feel their awareness of his presence like a physical weight. "Thompson!" Marcus called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Where are you?" "Right here, buddy," came the reply, though it seemed to emanate from every direction at once. "Just a little further. You're going to love what we found." The hallway finally opened into a large common room that defied the cabin's external dimensions. It was at least 3 times larger than the entire structure should have allowed, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow. Dozens of soldiers from different eras sat at various tables, all engaged in activities that spoke of permanent residence rather than temporary shelter. Some played poker with cards that never seemed to run out, others cleaned weapons that gleamed with an unnatural polish, and still others simply sat in comfortable chairs, smoking cigarettes that never burned down. At the far end of the room, Thompson and Rodriguez sat at a table with 3 other men Marcus didn't recognize. All 5 were hunched over what appeared to be a map, their faces animated with excitement. Thompson looked up as Marcus approached, and for a moment his expression seemed wrong, too wide, too eager, with eyes that reflected the lamplight like an animal's. "Marcus, finally!" Thompson stood, and Marcus noticed his movements seemed slightly off, as if he were moving through water. "Look at this. These guys have been here since 1952. Can you believe it? They've been waiting all this time." "Waiting for what?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Rodriguez looked up from the map, and Marcus saw the same unsettling gleam in his eyes. "For their unit to be complete," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying an odd echoing quality. "They've been 1 man short for 70 years. Isn't that something?" One of the strangers at the table, a man with captain's bars on his collar, smiled at Marcus with teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "We've been hoping someone would join us," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "It gets lonely, being stuck between worlds. But now that you're here, we can finally move on." Marcus backed toward the doorway, but when he turned, the hallway had vanished. Solid walls stretched where the entrance had been, trapping him in this impossible room with soldiers who should have been dead for generations. Marcus pressed his back against the cabin's exterior wall, feeling the rough-hewn logs scrape against his tactical vest. The voices inside had grown more insistent, their pleas weaving together into a symphony of desperation that made his teeth ache. He forced himself to focus on his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way his drill sergeant had taught him during his first deployment. The photograph burned in his breast pocket like a coal against his chest. Those faces, those names etched in fading ink beneath each soldier's image. How many wars had this place witnessed? How many souls had it claimed? A new sound cut through the ghostly chorus, the distinct scrape of metal against wood. Marcus tensed, recognizing the noise immediately. Someone was cleaning a rifle inside the cabin. The methodical rhythm was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate strokes of a cleaning rod being drawn through a barrel. He edged toward the nearest window, keeping low. The glass was impossibly clean despite the ash and debris that coated everything else in this desolate landscape. Through it, he could see shadows moving with purpose, shapes that seemed solid one moment and translucent the next. "You can't run forever, Marcus." The voice belonged to Collins, but it carried an authority that the young private had never possessed in life. "Every soldier finds his way here eventually. This is where wars end." Marcus gritted his teeth. "Not my war." A laugh echoed from inside, bitter and hollow. "You think you're different? You think your cause is more just than ours?" The voice shifted, becoming older, gruffer. "I fought at Gettysburg, boy. Thought I was preserving the Union. Thought my death would mean something." Another voice joined in, this one with a slight accent Marcus couldn't place. "I died at Verdun. For king and country," they said. "All I found was mud and poison gas." "Normandy," came a third voice, barely above a whisper. "We thought we were liberating the world." The cleaning rod continued its rhythmic scraping, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it wasn't just one rifle being maintained. The sound was multiplying, overlapping, as dozens of unseen hands worked to prepare weapons for battles that would never come. He forced himself to move, creeping around the cabin's perimeter. There had to be something here, some clue that would explain this nightmare. The structure itself defied logic, every board perfectly aligned, every corner precisely square, as if it had been built by master craftsmen rather than military engineers. At the cabin's rear, he found what he was looking for. A small wooden post driven into the ground, weathered but still legible. The carved letters made his blood run cold. Camp Limbo, Est 1863. Below the main inscription, hundreds of names had been carved into the wood over the decades. Some were deep and clear, others barely visible scratches. Marcus ran his fingers over them, feeling the stories embedded in each mark. Patterson, Mueller, Kowalski, Yamamoto, names from different wars, different centuries, all gathered in this impossible place. "You found it." Collins's voice came from directly behind him. Marcus spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. But Collins wasn't there, at least not in any way that mattered. The young soldier's form wavered like heat shimmer, his military fatigues shifting between modern camouflage and uniforms Marcus didn't recognize. "Found what?" Marcus managed to say. "The truth." Collins gestured toward the post. "This isn't just a cabin, Marcus. It's a way station, a place between the world of the living and whatever comes after." "That's impossible." "Is it?" Collins tilted his head, and for a moment his face became clear, solid. The bullet hole in his forehead was gone, replaced by a look of infinite sadness. "You've seen things in your wars that defied explanation, cities that shouldn't exist, people who survived things that should have killed them. The universe has rules, Marcus, but it also has exceptions." The scraping sounds from inside the cabin suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. "They're waiting for you," Collins continued. "All of them. Every soldier who ever questioned whether their sacrifice meant anything, every warrior who wondered if there was supposed to be something more than blood and mud and screaming." Marcus looked back at the post, at the endless list of names. His own name wasn't there yet, but he could see where it would go, at the bottom, carved fresh into the wood. "What happens if I go inside?" "Peace," Collins said simply. "No more guilt, no more nightmares, no more wondering if the people you couldn't save are disappointed in you." The cabin door creaked open behind them, spilling warm yellow light across the barren ground. The voices inside had gone quiet, but Marcus could feel their presence, their hope, their desperate need for one more brother in arms to share their eternal vigil. He took a step toward the door, then stopped. Something nagged at him, some detail that didn't fit. In his peripheral vision, he caught sight of something that made his heart race, fresh tire tracks in the ash, leading away from the cabin toward the horizon. The journal's pages crackled like dried leaves as Marcus turned them, each entry revealing another layer of the cabin's malevolent history. Lieutenant William Hayes had documented everything with military precision, his handwriting growing more erratic as the weeks progressed into months, then years. Day 47. Found another one today. Private Morrison from the 82nd. Been dead 3 weeks, but he walked right up to the door asking for chow. Invited him in. Had to. The cabin won't let them leave once they know it's here. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. The entries weren't from decades ago. They were recent. Hayes had been trapped here for less than 2 years, not since World War II as Marcus had assumed. The dates proved it. Day 156. Tried burning the place down. Fire wouldn't take. Doused every inch in kerosene, struck match after match. The flames died the moment they touched the walls. The cabin protects itself. It needs us. The voices outside grew louder, more insistent. Marcus recognized Patterson's Kentucky drawl now, mixing with unfamiliar accents from different eras. Southern drawls that could have been Civil War, clipped Eastern speech patterns from the Great War, modern military slang from recent conflicts. All of them calling his name, all of them waiting. Day 298. Understanding more now. The cabin exists between moments, between the spaces where death lingers. Every battlefield feeds it. Every soldier who dies with unfinished business, with words unsaid or missions incomplete, we're drawn here. The lucky ones pass through. The rest of us. The entry cut off mid-sentence. The next page was blank, except for a single line written in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. We are the garrison of the in-between. Marcus slammed the journal shut, his breathing ragged. He had to get out, whatever this place was, whatever force kept it anchored to every battlefield across history. He couldn't become part of it. He wouldn't let himself join that chorus of the dead. The floorboards creaked overhead, slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was in the loft. "Hayes?" Marcus called, though he knew better. Hayes had been dead for months, maybe longer. The journal entries stopped abruptly at day 312. The footsteps paused, then resumed, moving toward the ladder. Marcus grabbed his rifle, checking the magazine from pure habit, though he suspected bullets would be useless here. The rungs groaned under weight that shouldn't exist. Boots appeared first, standard-issue combat boots, but wrong somehow. Too clean, too new, yet aged at the same time. Then legs in BDUs, a torso, and finally a face that made Marcus's finger freeze on the trigger. It was Hayes, but not as he'd been in the photograph. This version was translucent, edges blurred like smoke. His eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been awake for far too long, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "You read my journal." It wasn't a question. Marcus kept the rifle trained on him, though his hands trembled. "You're dead." Death is relative here. Hayes stepped off the ladder, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. "Time moves differently. I've been watching you since you arrived, hoping you'd be stronger than the others, hoping you'd resist the call. What is this place?" "A wound," Hayes said, moving closer. "Think of reality as skin, Staff Sergeant. Battlefields are cuts, violent tears where death comes too suddenly, too brutally. Most heal clean, but some fester. This cabin grows in the infected ones, feeding on the souls caught between life and death." Marcus backed toward the door, but found it sealed. His hand passed through the handle as if it were made of mist. "Let me out." "I can't. Only you can choose to leave, and you have to truly want to go. No unfinished business, no guilt, no regrets holding you to the world of the living." Hayes's expression was almost pitying. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant, when your squad died, were you leading them into that ambush?" The question hit like a physical blow. Marcus felt his legs weaken, the rifle barrel dropping toward the floor. The guilt he'd buried under rage and survival instinct came flooding back. His decision to take the shortcut through the ravine, his choice that led them into enemy crossfire. I see it in your eyes, Hayes continued. The weight of command, of choices made and lives lost. That's what keeps us here. Patterson blames himself for not checking that doorway. Morrison thinks he should have spotted the IED. We all carry the dead with us, but some of us carry them too far. Outside, the voices grew more urgent, more welcoming. Marcus could hear his own squad now, calling him to join them, promising forgiveness he'd never found in life. The cabin's walls pulsed like a heartbeat, warm and inviting. Choose quickly, Hayes whispered. Dawn is coming, and with it, another chance at peace. But if you stay past sunrise... He gestured toward the window, where the first pale hints of light were already creeping across the horizon. The photograph trembled in Marcus's hands as the implications crashed over him like artillery fire. Lieutenant James Morrison, the man whose voice had been calling to him, whose memories had bled into his own, stared back at him from the faded image with eyes that held the same desperate hunger Marcus had seen in his dreams. Impossible, he whispered, but the evidence was undeniable. The date on the back read 1944, yet Morrison looked exactly as he had when Marcus first encountered him in the cabin. Not aged, not changed, frozen in that moment between life and death. The journal entries painted a horrifying picture. Morrison's unit had discovered the cabin during the final push into Germany, just as Marcus had found it 75 years later. They'd taken shelter from the relentless bombardment, grateful for walls that seemed untouched by war. But something had gone wrong. The entries became increasingly erratic, describing voices in the walls, shadows that moved independently of their owners, and a growing compulsion to never leave. The final entry, written in Morrison's increasingly unsteady hand, chilled Marcus to the bone. The cabin feeds on us. Not our bodies, our essence. It keeps us here, trapped between what we were and what we're becoming. I can feel myself slipping away piece by piece. God help whoever finds this place next. A sound from above made Marcus freeze. Footsteps crossing the cabin floor. Slow, deliberate, searching. His blood turned to ice as he realized he'd left the trapdoor open in his haste to descend. The beam of his flashlight caught something else in the corner, a military radio, its components corroded but still recognizable. Beside it lay more photographs, more journals, more evidence of those who'd been trapped here before. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Marcus Morrison's voice drifted down through the opening, no longer the desperate plea it had been before. Now it carried an edge of authority, of command. You've seen enough. Come back up. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, though he knew bullets would be useless against whatever Morrison had become. The photographs scattered as he fumbled through more of the journals, finding entries dating back decades further. The cabin had been claiming victims since at least 1918, maybe longer. Each group of soldiers thought they'd found salvation, only to discover they'd walked into a trap that fed on human souls. I know you're down there, Staff Sergeant. Morrison's voice hardened. Don't make this difficult. The temperature in the cellar began to drop, and Marcus could see his breath misting in the air. Frost began forming on the walls, spreading outward from some unseen source. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. He grabbed the most recent journal and stuffed it into his jacket, then began searching frantically for another way out. The cellar was small, cramped, but there had to be something, a window, another door, anything. His flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing nothing but solid stone and earth. Above him, more voices joined Morrison's. The other soldiers from the cabin, all speaking in unison now. Come home, Marcus. Join us. You don't have to fight anymore. The seductive pull of their words made his knees weak. Part of him wanted to surrender, to climb back up and accept whatever peace they offered. The war would be over. The nightmares would end. He could rest at last. But the journal in his jacket reminded him of the truth. This wasn't peace. It was a living death. These men weren't at rest. They were prisoners, slowly being consumed by whatever malevolent force inhabited the cabin. His flashlight beam finally caught something promising, a section of the back wall that looked different from the rest. Older stones, different mortar. He pressed against it and felt it give slightly. It was another passage, probably sealed up long ago but weakened by time and moisture. "Marcus!" Morrison's voice boomed with supernatural force. "Return to us now!" The compulsion hit him like a physical blow, driving him to his knees. His vision blurred as images flooded his mind, memories that weren't his own. Morrison's final moments, the other soldiers' last breaths, the horrible realization that the cabin was alive and hungry. He saw decades of victims, all drawn by the promise of sanctuary, all consumed by an entity that existed in the spaces between life and death. Fighting against the mental assault, Marcus threw his shoulder against the weakened wall. The old mortar crumbled, and stones tumbled away to reveal a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. Without hesitation, he squeezed through the opening just as something heavy landed in the cellar behind him. The tunnel was cramped and filled with the smell of decay, but it led away from the cabin. As he crawled through the suffocating darkness, Morrison's enraged screams echoed behind him, no longer human, but something far worse. The voices of all the trapped soldiers joined in a chorus of fury that made the very earth tremble. Marcus crawled faster, driven by the desperate hope that somewhere ahead lay freedom and the chance to ensure no one else would ever find that cursed sanctuary. The journal's pages crackled like autumn leaves as Marcus turned them, each entry revealing another layer of Lieutenant Morrison's descent into madness. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, words scratching across paper with desperate urgency. Day 23, the voices are stronger now. They know things about me, things I've never told anyone. Sarah's laugh when she found my letters, the way Tommy's eyes went glassy in Normandy. How can they know these things? Marcus felt the temperature in the cabin drop several degrees. The whispers had quieted, but he sensed their presence pressing against the walls like a gathering storm. His flashlight beam wavered across the page as he continued reading. Day 31. I understand now. The cabin isn't just a shelter. It's a collection point. Every soldier who dies with unfinished business, with words left unsaid, finds their way here eventually. The boundary between life and death is thinner in places where so much blood has been spilled. A floorboard creaked behind Marcus. He spun around, but the cabin remained empty except for shadows that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The photograph of Morrison's family watched him from the table, their smiles now appearing forced, knowing. Day 45. I tried to leave again today, made it almost to the tree line before the pull became unbearable. It's not the voices calling me back, it's something deeper, a hunger. The cabin feeds on us, on our guilt and regret. It grows stronger with each soul it claims. Marcus's hands trembled as he absorbed Morrison's words. The weight of his own guilt pressed down like a physical force. Every decision that had led to his men's deaths played through his mind in vivid detail. The faulty intelligence he should have questioned, the route he'd chosen through the minefield, the split-second hesitation that had cost 3 lives. Day 52, I know what I have to do. The only way to break the cycle is to destroy the source. But I'm too weak now, too far gone. Someone else will have to finish what I started, someone with enough strength left to resist its call. The journal's final entries were barely legible, scrawled in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Marcus squinted at the faded words, piecing together Morrison's last coherent thoughts. The foundation stone, beneath the hearth, carved with symbols older than any war, must be broken, must be... The writing trailed off into incomprehensible scratches, and then nothing. Marcus flipped through the remaining blank pages, his heart pounding. Morrison had figured out the truth but died before he could act on it. A sound from outside made Marcus freeze, the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. Multiple sets, marching in formation. He crept to the window and peered through a gap in the boards. In the pale moonlight he could make out the silhouettes of soldiers approaching the cabin. But these weren't the spirits he'd been hearing. These figures cast shadows, their equipment clanking with metallic reality. Marcus quickly extinguished his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall. His radio crackled to life with a burst of static. Bravo 7, this is command. We've got a lock on your position. Extraction team is en route. Maintain radio silence until contact is established. The transmission cut off, leaving Marcus in darkness. The extraction team, they'd found him. But something felt wrong. According to his watch, it had been less than 6 hours since he'd radioed for help. Even with helicopters, response time should have been longer. The footsteps circled the cabin now, deliberate and methodical. Through the thin walls, Marcus heard muffled voices giving orders, but the words seemed distorted, as if spoken through water or from a great distance. Target confirmed inside the structure. Negative on heat signatures from the perimeter. Recommend immediate containment protocol. Marcus frowned. Containment protocol wasn't standard extraction procedure, and why couldn't they detect his heat signature, unless they weren't using standard military equipment? The door handle rattled. Marcus gripped his sidearm, though something told him bullets wouldn't be effective against whatever was trying to get in. The whispers of the dead soldiers grew agitated, their voices overlapping in urgent warning. Don't let them in, Marcus. They're not who they claim to be. The cabin protects us. It protects you. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very spirits trying to trap his soul were now warning him against a different threat. Morrison's journal had mentioned that the cabin grew stronger with each soul it claimed. Perhaps these entities outside represented competition for his spirit. A sharp bang echoed through the cabin as something struck the door with tremendous force. The wooden barrier held, but Marcus could see splinters appearing around the frame. Whatever was outside possessed strength far beyond human capability. He looked down at Morrison's journal, then at the hearth across the room. The foundation stone lay hidden beneath decades of ash and debris. Morrison had discovered the secret, but lacked the will to act. Now the choice fell to Marcus: face the unknown threat outside, surrender to the cabin's eternal embrace, or attempt what Morrison couldn't finish. The door splintered further. Time was running out. The basement stretched further than physics should have allowed, disappearing into shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with their own malevolent life. Marcus pressed forward, the journal clutched against his chest like a shield, though he knew paper and ink would offer no protection against what waited in the darkness ahead. His boots echoed against stone steps that grew older with each descent, the concrete giving way to rough-hewn rock that belonged to no era he could identify. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying scents of earth and decay and something else, something that made his throat close and his eyes water. Behind him, the voices of the trapped soldiers grew fainter, their desperate pleas fading as if the distance between them expanded beyond mere physical space. But ahead, something else called to him. Not voices this time, but a sound like breathing, deep, rhythmic inhalations that seemed to draw in more than just air. The narrow beam of his flashlight caught something carved into the stone wall. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, their angles wrong in ways that made his vision blur. Between them, scratched in what looked suspiciously like dried blood, were dates, hundreds of them, spanning decades, maybe centuries. 1847, 1863, 1917, 1943, 1967, 1991, 2003, 2011. The dates of wars, Marcus realized with growing horror. Every major conflict, every battlefield where soldiers had died in large numbers, and beneath each date, tally marks. So many tally marks that they covered the walls like a twisted inventory of the dead. The breathing grew louder. Marcus forced himself to continue down the endless stairs, his legs trembling with each step. The journal's leather cover felt warm against his palm, and he could swear he felt Catherine's handwriting shifting beneath his fingers, the ink still wet after all these years. Then the stairs ended. He stood at the threshold of a vast chamber carved from living rock. In the center, surrounded by concentric circles of those same wrong-angled symbols, sat something that his mind refused to properly process. It was large and dark and constantly moving, though it never seemed to change position. Tentacles or roots or veins, he couldn't tell which, stretched out from its central mass, disappearing into the walls, the ceiling, the floor itself, and it was breathing. With each inhalation, The symbols on the walls pulsed with sickly light. With each exhalation, whispers filled the air, thousands of voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, though somehow he understood their meaning. They spoke of hunger, of an endless gnawing need that could never be satisfied, of a thing that had slumbered beneath the earth since before humanity learned to make war, feeding on the souls of those who died in violence and despair. The cabin wasn't a sanctuary. It was bait, a lure to draw in soldiers who had been touched by death but hadn't yet crossed over completely. The thing fed on their essence, their memories of battle and loss, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. Marcus understood now why Catherine Donovan had tried to document everything. She had been like him, a survivor who had stumbled too close to something that should have remained hidden. But unlike the others, she had fought back, using her knowledge of folklore and her desperate love for the soldiers trapped above to find a way to resist the creature's hunger. The journal grew hot in his hands, and when he looked down, new words were appearing on the pages in Catherine's careful script. It cannot take what is freely given to another purpose. The souls above, they are not lost if someone remembers them truly, if someone carries their stories forward. But the choice must be made willingly, and the cost. The writing stopped, leaving Marcus in the pulsing darkness with the breathing thing and its impossible hunger. He understood what Catherine was trying to tell him. There was a way to free the trapped soldiers, but it would require sacrifice. Someone had to take their place, to feed the creature's need while the others escaped whatever hold it had on them. But that someone didn't have to remain trapped forever. Catherine had found another way, a loophole in whatever ancient contract bound this thing. The souls could be given purpose beyond feeding the creature's hunger. They could be remembered, their stories told, their sacrifice honored in a way that transcended the creature's need for spiritual sustenance. The tentacle things writhed closer, and Marcus felt the pull of the creature's will pressing against his mind. It had been waiting so long, feeding on scraps and echoes. A fresh soul, one still warm with life and recent trauma, would sustain it for years. Above him, he could hear the soldiers calling his name. Thompson, Rodriguez, Chen, all of them trapped in their eternal loop of false safety and growing despair. They were counting on him to find a way out, to be the leader he had never managed to be when they were alive. Marcus opened the journal to a blank page and began to write. The journal's leather cover cracked like old bones as Marcus opened it to the final entry. His hands trembled, whether from exhaustion or dread, he couldn't tell anymore. The cabin's shadows seemed to lean closer as he read Captain William Morrison's last words, written in increasingly erratic handwriting. Day 847. They've stopped pretending. The ones who look like soldiers, they're wearing faces that don't belong to them. Jenkins tried to leave again today. When he touched the door, his hand passed right through it. We're not guests here. We're ingredients. Marcus looked up from the page, his blood turning to ice. The voices from the parlor had grown quieter, almost conspiratorial. He could make out individual words now, fresh, strong, and something that sounded like vessel. The thing that calls itself the Keeper showed me what it really is today. Beneath the uniform, beneath the kind face, there's nothing but hunger. It feeds on memory, on the essence of who we were. Each day we fade a little more. Thompson forgot his wife's name yesterday. Rodriguez can't remember what color his eyes used to be. The floorboards above Marcus's head groaned with deliberate footsteps, slow, measured, circling, hunting. He forced himself to continue reading, knowing that Morrison's words might be his only chance at understanding what he was truly facing. I understand now why this place appears pristine while everything outside rots. It exists between moments, in the space where souls linger before moving on. The Keeper, God, what a mockery of a name. It's been here since the first wars began, drawing in the lost and the desperate. We weren't the first, and Kane won't be the last. Marcus nearly dropped the journal. His name, written in 70-year-old ink by a man who died before Marcus was born. The impossibility of it made his vision blur, reality tilting like a ship in rough seas. If someone finds this, If another poor bastard stumbles into this beautiful trap, know this: the keeper can only hold you if you accept what it offers. The food, the warmth, the promise of peace, it's all bait. But it has rules, old rules that bind it. It must be invited in, it must be welcomed. The footsteps above stopped directly over Marcus's position. Dust rained down from the ceiling as something heavy settled there, waiting. The voices in the parlor ceased their murmuring. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, as if the entire cabin was holding its breath. The true soldiers, the ones it's already consumed, they're not evil. They're echoes, puppets dancing on strings of stolen memory. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I see flashes of who they really were. They're trying to warn newcomers, but the keeper twists their words, makes kindness sound like invitation. Marcus thought of Hendrix's desperate whisper, the way his eyes had pleaded even as his mouth spoke words of welcome. The man had been trying to save him, fighting against the thing that wore his form like an ill-fitting coat. There is a way out. The keeper drew us here through our guilt, our unfinished business. It feeds on regret. But if someone could face what brought them here without flinching, without seeking the easy comfort this place offers, the binding would weaken. The guilty seek absolution. The innocent seek truth. I pray whoever reads this is stronger than we were. A soft knock came at the cellar door. 3 gentle raps, like a friend asking permission to enter. "Marcus?" The keeper's voice drifted down, honey-sweet and patient. "The others are worried about you. You've been down there so long. Come up and join us. We have so much to discuss." Marcus's throat constricted. The voice was his own, not similar but identical. The keeper was wearing him now, practicing for when it no longer needed the original. Final entry. I won't let it take me completely. Jenny deserves better than a hollow echo of her husband. If this doesn't work, if my soul becomes another ingredient in its feast, then may God forgive us all. The ammunition stores are directly beneath the cabin's foundation. 1 grenade, properly placed. The journal ended there, the pen trailing off into illegible scratches. Marcus understood now why the cabin remained pristine despite the destruction outside. Morrison had tried to destroy it, but the keeper existed beyond physical destruction. It had simply rebuilt itself, reset the trap, and waited for the next lost soul to stumble into its web. "Marcus!" The voice came again, but this time it was different. Hendrix, raw with desperation. "Don't listen to it." The ammunition. Morrison was right about the ammunition. The keeper's borrowed voice turned sharp, angry. "Hendrix, you know the rules, no interference." But the seed was planted. Marcus looked around the cellar with new eyes, noting the unusual construction, the way certain stones seemed newer than others. Morrison hadn't failed. He'd forced the keeper to rebuild over its own weakness. The ammunition was still there, waiting beneath decades of carefully laid stones, and Marcus finally understood what he had to do. The basement stretched farther than any structure above ground should have allowed, its stone walls sweating with moisture that had nothing to do with the climate outside. Marcus's flashlight beam carved through darkness so thick it seemed to push back, and with each step deeper into the bowels of the cabin, the temperature dropped another degree. The voices had grown louder since he descended the creaking wooden stairs, no longer the distant murmur of conversation, but distinct words, clear commands, desperate pleas. They echoed off the stone in a cacophony that made his skull throb. "Left flank, watch your 6. Medic. Jesus Christ, somebody get a medic. Hold the line, boys. Don't let them through." Marcus pressed his back against the cold stone wall, trying to steady his breathing. The voices belonged to different wars, different decades. He could hear the clipped vowels of World War II alongside the drawl of Vietnam, the urgent communications of Korea mixing with what sounded like Civil War to era commands. All of them trapped down here, replaying their final moments in an endless loop. His flashlight swept across crude symbols carved into the walls, not the protective sigils he'd found upstairs, but something else entirely. These marks were older, deeper, cut with a precision that spoke of ritual and purpose. They formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometries that seemed to shift when he wasn't focusing on them. The corridor branched ahead, splitting into 3 passages that disappeared into absolute darkness. From the leftmost tunnel came the sound of marching feet, dozens of boots hitting stone in perfect unison. The middle passage echoed with the metallic clink of dog tags and the whispered recitation of names, ranks, serial numbers. But it was the rightmost tunnel that drew him, because from its depths came a voice he recognized. "Marcus!" Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Voss's voice drifted through the darkness like smoke. "You need to see this." Every rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but his feet carried him forward anyway. The tunnel sloped downward, and the carved symbols became more elaborate, more wrong. Some were filled with a dark substance that might have been dried blood, others seemed to pulse with their own internal light. The passage opened into a circular chamber, and Marcus's flashlight illuminated a sight that nearly dropped him to his knees. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing a figure in military dress. Some wore uniforms from wars he recognized, others from conflicts that seemed impossibly old. Each figure sat perfectly still, hands folded in their laps, eyes closed as if in meditation, but they were breathing. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar covered in the same disturbing symbols. Upon it lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age but its ink still wet. Marcus approached slowly, his flashlight beam revealing page after page of handwritten entries, in different handwriting, different languages, but all telling variations of the same story. Soldiers finding the cabin, seeking shelter, being drawn below, and never leaving. The first entry is from 1863. Voss's voice came from directly behind him. Marcus spun around, but she wasn't there, only empty air and the sound of his own ragged breathing. A Union sergeant named Thaddeus Cole, her voice continued from somewhere in the darkness. He found this place after the Battle of Gettysburg, thought he'd discovered a miracle, a sanctuary where the living could speak with the honored dead. Marcus's flashlight revealed fresh writing appearing on the journal's open page, words forming in real time as if guided by an invisible hand. But the dead weren't honored here, Voss continued. They were harvested, collected, their final moments preserved and replayed for the entertainment of something that feeds on conflict, on the raw emotion of soldiers facing death. The figures in the alcoves began to stir, heads turning toward Marcus with movements too slow to be natural. Their eyes opened, revealing sockets filled with the same pale light that leaked from the carved symbols. Cole realized what this place truly was, Voss said, her voice now coming from multiple directions at once. He tried to destroy it, to free the souls trapped here, but the entity that owns this place had already marked him, just as it marked every soldier who followed. Marcus backed toward the tunnel entrance, but it had vanished, replaced by solid stone wall. The chamber was shrinking, or perhaps the alcoves were moving closer, bringing their occupants within arm's reach, just as it's marked you, Marcus. The journal's pages fluttered without wind, settling on a fresh page where new words began to appear. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane, 2nd Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment. Found sanctuary October 15, 2023. Joined the Eternal Watch. Marcus grabbed the journal and pressed his combat knife against its binding. The moment the blade touched leather, every figure in the alcoves opened their mouths and screamed in perfect, horrible unison. The sound hit him like a physical blow, driving him to his knees as blood ran from his ears. But he didn't let go of the knife. The basement stretched further than physics should have allowed, its stone walls disappearing into shadows that seemed to breathe. Marcus pressed forward, the screams of the trapped souls echoing behind him as he followed the tunnel deeper into the earth. His flashlight beam trembled against the rough-hewn walls, revealing scratch marks that looked suspiciously like fingernails. The air grew thicker with each step, laden with the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something that made his stomach churn. Sulfur, decay. The sweet corruption of promises broken and souls devoured. You cannot escape what you've already chosen, The keeper's voice drifted through the tunnel, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Every step you take brings you closer to me." Marcus ignored the taunt, focusing on the sensation pulling him forward, a magnetic draw that felt both alien and familiar. The entity that had orchestrated this nightmare was close now. He could feel its presence pressing against his mind like oil seeping through cracks. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber carved from living rock. Ancient symbols covered every surface, their meaning lost to time but their malevolence unmistakable. They seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the chamber's center stood an altar of black stone, its surface stained dark with centuries of sacrifice. Around it, arranged in concentric circles, were dozens of uniforms from different wars. Some he recognized, others from conflicts that predated modern memory. Each uniform hung suspended in the air as if worn by invisible soldiers, swaying gently despite the absence of any wind. "Welcome to my collection." The entity's voice no longer came through the keeper, but filled the chamber with its own terrible presence. Every war, every battlefield, every moment of perfect despair. I am there to gather those whose souls burn brightest with regret. Marcus stepped into the circle of uniforms, his weapon raised despite knowing bullets would be useless here. "What do you want?" A laugh echoed through the chamber, coming from the uniforms themselves. "Want? I want nothing more than what I already have, an endless feast of guilt and sorrow, seasoned with the bitter salt of choices that cannot be unmade." The uniforms began to move, stepping forward as the spirits of their former wearers manifested. Marcus saw Civil War blue and grey, World War doughboy browns, Vietnam jungle fatigues and desert camouflage from more recent conflicts. Each soldier bore the wounds of their final moments, bullet holes, shrapnel tears, burns that would never heal. "We tried to resist," one of them whispered, his throat torn open by shrapnel. "But the guilt, it's so heavy. Easier to let it consume you than to fight." Marcus felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the crushing burden of every decision he'd made in combat, every life lost under his command. The entity fed on this, he realized, not just death but the psychological wounds that survived long after the physical battles ended. "Thompson didn't have to die," the voice in his head whispered. "You could have saved him. You could have saved all of them." "No," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "War is chaos. People die. Good people die, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it." The chamber shuddered at his words, the symbols on the walls flaring brighter. The entity's presence pressed harder against his mind, seeking cracks in his resolve. "But you carry their names," it hissed. "You feel the weight of their absence. You've built an altar to guilt in your own heart, and I am the only God who offers absolution." Marcus saw the truth then, blazing clear despite the crushing darkness around him. "You don't offer absolution. You offer surrender. There's a difference." He moved toward the altar, each step a monumental effort against the psychic pressure bearing down on him. The trapped spirits reached out with pleading hands, but he pushed through their ranks. "Guilt isn't absolution," he said, his voice growing stronger, "and carrying their memory isn't the same as carrying their deaths. They chose to serve. They chose to stand between evil and innocence. That choice has meaning, even when the cost is everything." The entity shrieked, its fury shaking dust from the chamber ceiling. The uniforms began to fade as their wearers found something they'd forgotten in the endless twilight of their imprisonment: purpose, honor, the knowledge that some sacrifices, however painful, were worth making. Marcus reached the altar and placed his hands on its blood-stained surface. The entity's power flowed through it like a river of molten hatred, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he channeled everything he'd learned about leadership, about sacrifice, about the difference between dying for something and dying for nothing. "Your hold on them is broken," he declared. "Guilt without purpose is poison, but guilt transformed into remembrance, into honoring their sacrifice by living worthy of it, that's freedom." The chamber began to collapse around him as the entity's scream reached a pitch that threatened to shatter his sanity. But Marcus held firm, pouring his own guilt and pain into the altar, not to feed the darkness, but to transform it into something else entirely. The basement walls seemed to breathe around Marcus as he descended the creaking wooden stairs, each step taking him deeper into the cabin's malevolent heart. The whispers had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against his eardrums like cotton soaked in blood. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone foundations that predated the cabin above by decades, maybe centuries. Ancient symbols covered the walls, not carved, but burned into the stone as if branded by unseen hands. Marcus recognized some from his grandfather's old books about the war, sigils that spoke of binding rituals and souls trapped between worlds. The air grew colder with each step, his breath forming ghostly clouds that seemed to linger longer than they should. At the bottom, a single room opened before him, its corners lost in shadow despite his light. In the center sat a massive wooden table, its surface stained dark with what Marcus prayed was merely age. Upon it lay scattered photographs, hundreds of them, depicting soldiers from different eras. Some wore the uniforms of the Great War, others from conflicts Marcus couldn't identify. But their eyes were all the same, empty, pleading. "You found us," came a voice behind him. Marcus spun around to see Corporal Harrison standing at the base of the stairs, but this wasn't the translucent spectre he'd grown accustomed to. Harrison appeared solid, real, yet wrong in ways Marcus couldn't articulate. His uniform was pristine, free of the mud and blood that had defined their final battle. "What is this place?" Marcus demanded, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. Harrison stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the stone floor. "The collection room, where he keeps us all." He gestured toward the photographs with a movement that seemed to lag behind his intention. "Every soul he's claimed, every warrior who thought they'd found sanctuary." Marcus's hand tightened on his rifle, though he wondered what good bullets would do here. Who's doing this?" "The Keeper," Harrison said, and as the words left his lips, the temperature plummeted. Frost began forming on the stone walls, spreading outward like infection. "He's been here since before the first wars, feeding on the desperate and the dying. We come seeking refuge, and instead—" Harrison's form flickered, revealing glimpses of his true state, torn flesh, vacant eye sockets, a mouth frozen in an eternal scream. The photographs on the table began to move, faces turning toward Marcus with slow, mechanical precision. In their paper eyes, he saw the same hunger that had haunted the cabin's whispers. They wanted him to join them, to add his soul to their endless collection. "There's a way out," Harrison said suddenly, his voice regaining some of its former humanity. "But you have to choose quickly. He's coming." "Who's coming?" The basement began to shake, dust raining from the ceiling as something massive moved overhead. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crossed the cabin floor above them. But these weren't the steps of any normal man. They echoed with the weight of centuries, each impact reverberating through Marcus's bones. "The Keeper manifests physically only when a soul is ready for harvesting," Harrison explained, his form growing more translucent with each passing second. "You've resisted too long. He's coming to claim you personally." Marcus looked around desperately, searching for another exit, but found only stone walls and shadow. "You said there was a way out." "Destroy the anchor," Harrison said, pointing to something Marcus had missed in his initial survey. In the far corner sat a small wooden chest, unremarkable except for the fact that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "That's where he keeps the first soul he ever claimed. His power stems from that original binding." The footsteps overhead stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus heard something far worse, the sound of the basement door opening, its hinges screaming like tortured souls. A presence began descending the stairs, each step accompanied by a low humming that made Marcus's teeth ache. "Go," Harrison urged, his voice fading as his form dissolved entirely. "Before he reaches the bottom. Before it's too late." Marcus ran toward the chest, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the symbols on the walls. Behind him, the humming grew louder, accompanied now by the wet sound of something dragging across stone. He didn't dare look back, focusing instead on the small wooden box that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. His hands found the chest's lid, and immediately pain shot through his arms as if he'd grasped live wires. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by something far worse. Laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls and inside Marcus's skull simultaneously. Staff Sergeant Kane spoke, a voice like grinding stone and screaming wind. "Welcome home." Marcus turned to see the keeper rising from the shadows, and what he witnessed would haunt him forever, if he lived long enough to be haunted. The photographs scattered across the floorboards like fallen leaves, each one a window into decades of suffering. Marcus knelt among them, his hands trembling as he picked up image after image of soldiers, young faces frozen in sepia tones, their eyes holding secrets that transcended death itself. "You see now," whispered Lieutenant Hayes, his spectral form materializing beside Marcus. "We weren't the first." The cabin groaned around them, its timbers seeming to pulse with malevolent life. Marcus studied the photographs more carefully, noting the different uniforms, the evolution of military gear spanning generations. World War I doughboys stood beside Vietnam grunts, Korean War veterans mixed with faces he couldn't place from conflicts he'd never heard of. "How many?" Marcus's voice cracked. "Hundreds," said Corporal Williams, appearing on his other side. "Maybe thousands. Every war, every battle fought on this ground. We all end up here eventually." Marcus felt the weight of understanding crushing down on him. The cabin wasn't just a trap, it was a collection point, a spiritual prison that had been harvesting souls for over a century. The pristine condition, the impossible preservation in the middle of devastation, it all made horrible sense now. "But why?" he demanded, struggling to his feet. "What keeps you here? What wants you?" The temperature in the room plummeted, and Marcus's breath came out in visible puffs. The photographs on the floor began to move, sliding across the wooden planks as if pulled by invisible strings. They formed a rough circle around him, and in the center, the floorboards began to crack and splinter. Something was coming up from below. "It feeds on us," Hayes said, his voice growing fainter as the presence beneath grew stronger. "Our pain, our regret, our unfinished business. Every soldier who dies with guilt in his heart, who carries the weight of what he's done, it calls to us." The floorboards exploded upward in a shower of splinters and dust. What emerged defied description, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that seemed to absorb light itself. Marcus stumbled backward, his rifle useless against this primordial darkness. Within the shadow, he could see faces, thousands of them, twisted in eternal anguish. Soldiers from every era, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes pleading for release that would never come. "Join us, Marcus," the thing spoke with the voices of the damned. "You belong here. You've killed. You've taken lives. The guilt burns in you like acid." Images flashed through Marcus's mind. The faces of enemies he'd eliminated, the collateral damage he'd witnessed, the civilians caught in crossfire. Every soldier carried these ghosts, these moments that haunted their sleep and poisoned their waking hours. "No," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You came here seeking death," the entity continued, its form shifting and writhing. "You wanted to end the pain. We offer something better, eternal purpose. Feed us your guilt, your anguish, and become part of something greater." The photographs around him began to glow, and Marcus saw his own face appearing in frame after frame, aging and weathering as decades passed. He saw himself standing in the cabin, guarding it, calling to other lost souls who would stumble upon this place. "It's not so bad," Williams whispered, his form becoming more solid. "The pain fades. You forget the weight of what you've done. You become nothing." Marcus snarled, understanding flooding through him. "You're not soldiers anymore. You're just food for this thing." The shadow entity laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying gasps. "What else would you be? Warriors without a war, killers without a cause. At least here, your suffering has meaning." Marcus thought of his squad, his real squad. Rodriguez with his terrible jokes, Thompson, who collected postcards from places he'd never been, Sanders, who talked about his daughter every night. They were dead, truly dead, but they died as themselves. They hadn't been reduced to this hollow existence. He thought of his sister Sarah, waiting for him to come home. Not this broken version of himself, but the brother she remembered before the war changed him. If he stayed here, if he gave in to the seductive promise of numbness, she would never know what happened to him. "I won't become you," Marcus said, backing toward the door. "I won't feed this thing." The entity roared, its form expanding to fill the cabin. The spectral soldiers reached for him with desperate hands, their faces contorting with rage and hunger. "You can't leave," Hayes screamed. "None of us can leave." Marcus's hand found the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. The wood felt hot against his palm, burning like molten metal. He was trapped, just like all the others. But unlike them, he knew what he was fighting. Unlike them, he'd seen the truth behind the beautiful lie. He just had to figure out how to use that knowledge before the darkness consumed him entirely. The cabin's walls began to shimmer and dissolve around Marcus, revealing the true horror beneath the pristine facade. What had appeared as polished wood and warm lamplight was nothing more than charred timber and bone-deep shadows. The comfortable chairs where ghostly soldiers had sat were twisted metal and debris. The welcoming fire was a gaping hole in the earth, still smouldering with an otherworldly flame that cast no real warmth. Marcus clutched the compass tighter, its needles spinning wildly as the supernatural forces fought against his decision to leave. The voices of the dead soldiers rose in a desperate chorus, no longer the friendly welcomes of phantom comrades, but the anguished wails of souls who had been trapped for decades. "Don't abandon us, Kane." The voice of Lieutenant Morrison, the first soldier he'd encountered, cut through the cacophony. "You know what it's like out there. You know the pain. Here, we can all rest together." But Marcus understood now that rest was exactly what they'd been denied. The cabin wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison, feeding off the guilt and trauma of soldiers who couldn't let go of their failures, their lost comrades, their unfinished battles. The entity that controlled this place had grown fat on their collective anguish, using their pain to lure others into the same eternal trap. "I won't add my voice to yours," Marcus said, his words steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "And I won't leave you here to suffer." He raised his rifle, not at the ghostly figures, but at the source of the otherworldly flame in the crater. The compass needle suddenly locked due north, and Marcus understood. The entity's anchor wasn't the cabin itself, but something buried deep in that burning pit, something that had been feeding on death and despair since the first shell fell on this battlefield. The soldiers' forms began to solidify as Marcus approached the crater's edge, their faces no longer welcoming masks, but desperate, pleading visages marked by the wounds that had killed them. Some bore bullet holes, others showed the terrible burns of chemical weapons or the devastating injuries of artillery strikes. They reached for him with phantom hands, and he realized they weren't trying to drag him down. They were trying to help him reach the pit. "It's down there," whispered a young private whose chest had been caved in by shrapnel, been feeding since 1943, growing stronger with every soul it claims. Marcus peered into the crater and saw it at last, a twisted mass of metal and flesh that pulsed with malevolent life. Parts of old artillery shells jutted from its surface, along with dog tags, photographs, and personal effects from countless soldiers. But at its center was something older, something that predated the wars entirely, an ancient hunger that had learned to feast on human conflict. The entity sensed his recognition, and the cabin shuddered violently. Windows that had never existed exploded outward in showers of phantom glass. The floor buckled and split, revealing the crater's true depth. Decades of accumulated death had fed this thing, and it wouldn't give up its harvest easily. Marcus took aim, but conventional weapons wouldn't be enough. He needed something more, the one thing the entity couldn't consume or corrupt. He thought of Sergeant Williams, dying in his arms in the real world beyond this nightmare. He thought of Private Chen, barely 19 and bleeding out from a roadside bomb. He thought of all the soldiers he'd lost, all the friends who'd died while he lived. But instead of letting the guilt consume him, as it had for so long, Marcus chose to honor their memory differently. They had died so others could live. They had sacrificed everything not to feed some cosmic horror, but to protect what mattered. Their deaths had meaning beyond this creature's endless hunger. "You don't get to use their sacrifice," Marcus said, and pulled the trigger. The bullet, charged with his newfound understanding and determination, struck the entity's core. The creature's shriek shattered the remaining illusion of the cabin completely, revealing the true battlefield, scarred earth under an ashen sky, but no longer trapped in eternal conflict. The ghostly soldiers began to fade, but their faces showed relief rather than despair. "Thank you," Morrison whispered as his form dissolved. "Tell them we can rest now." The entity's death throes sent shockwaves through the supernatural prison, and Marcus felt reality reasserting itself around him. The compass needle pointed true north once more. The voices faded into peaceful silence. The unnatural fog that had trapped him began to lift, revealing a path back to the living world. As Marcus walked away from the crater, now nothing more than a scar in ordinary earth, he carried with him the memory of those soldiers' final moments of peace. He would return to his squad, to Sergeant Williams if he still lived, to a war that continued in the real world, but he would no longer carry the weight of survivors' guilt that had nearly claimed his soul. The dead could finally rest, and the living could continue their fight with purpose rather than despair.